When people talk about the best running backs of all time, names like Barry Sanders, Emmitt Smith, Jim Brown, and Walter Payton get brought up the most. Even more modern backs like Marshall Faulk and LaDainian Tomlinson have their fans. But one name is often excluded from these lists, despite being a truly dominant force in his time. His name? Earl Campbell.
United States begins with Amici and the ball game is over. Alan Amici has scored the touchdown and the Baltimore Colts are the professional football champions of the world. His pass is broken up by Tatum. It's off.
Goes to the back of the end zone, and it is caught for a touchdown by Holmes. Unbelievable. Incredible. Second and goal. Pass. Got it.
Campbell's football journey started in Texas, playing for the Longhorns in college. His freshman season would prove to be a hint of how dominant he could become. Playing in 11 games that year, he would finish with 928 rushing yards and 6 touchdowns. By his second year, he already made a first-team All-American selection, posting over 1,000 yards and a Southwest Conference leading 13 rushing touchdowns. Unfortunately for him, a leg injury would keep him out of 4 games of his junior season, and Texas would stumble without the All-Star. The Longhorns were 10-2 in 1975. In 1976, the year of Campbell's injury, they were 5-1. His senior season was remarkable. Not only did he lead his conference in rushing yards and rushing touchdowns, he led the nation. In 11 games that year, he racked up 1,744 yards and 18 touchdowns. This included a game in Week 3 versus Rice University, where the Longhorns would absolutely pummel the Owls 72-15. Campbell himself scored 4 times that day. That's how dominant Texas was in 1977. They ended their regular season a perfect 11-0, and Campbell showed every NFL scout why he was worth drafting in the final regular season NCAA game of his career. Versus Texas A&M, Campbell rushed for a career-high 222 yards and a 57-28 victory. That game earned Texas a bowl game versus the 5th-ranked Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Despite Campbell rushing for 116 yards that day, Texas would lose that game 38-10. Oh, and by the way, look who the quarterback was for that Notre Dame team. At the conclusion of the season, Campbell was awarded the Heisman Trophy Award, the first Longhorn to ever receive the honor. He was poised to be the first pick of the NFL Draft. All he was waiting for was for the team to reveal itself. The 1977 NFL season was very unforgiving to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Bucs were still the NFL youngest team at the time, only being their second in franchise history. The team went 2-12, with their only 2 wins coming at the very end of the year versus the also terrible Saints and the mediocre Cardinals. Here's a funny thing though, the Buccaneers had the first overall pick in the last 2 NFL drafts. Not wanting to hold the distinction of the only team since the merger to have that pick 3 straight years, and wanting to stockpile draft picks, the team wanted to trade the selection. Besides, a lot of NFL teams wanted the right to draft the Heisman winner. The Bucs had a lot of holes, yes, but running back wasn't one of them. They had picked Ricky Bell with the first overall pick of the 1977 NFL Draft. Eventually, the Bucs found their trade partner. Bum Phillips, who was the coach of the Houston Oilers, fell in love with the tough running style Campbell displayed. The Oilers were close to being a good team around this time, but didn't have the running game needed to find true postseason success. They would give up tight end Jimmy Giles, along with first and second round pick in 1978, and a third and fifth round pick in 1979, to acquire the rights to draft their guy. The Oilers would lose their first game of '78, but that was of no fault of Campbell's. In his very first NFL game, he rushed for 137 yards and scored a touchdown, while boasting a 9.1 yards per carry average. The team would quickly find its footing, however, and finish the regular season with a 10-6 record. Campbell started in 14 of those games, and finished his year with 1,450 yards and 13 rushing touchdowns. That total rushing number was good for first in all of the NFL. That's right, he even beats out Walter Payton as a rookie for the rushing crown. Houston went ahead to Miami to play the Don Shula-led Dolphins in the wild card that year. And despite Campbell having a relatively subdued game, quarterback Dan Pastorini's 306 passing yards helped the Oilers vault past the Dolphins 17-9. The divisional round game was also on the road, this time in New England. Houston exploded with 21 points in the second quarter, and Campbell's 118 rushing yards sent Houston to the AFC Championship game for the first time since 1967. Unfortunately, they ran into the juggernaut that was the 70s Steelers and got blown out 34-5. Another bright side, 78 was still the club's most successful season in a very long time. 1979 was even better, both for Houston and for Campbell. The team finished 11-5, but because they were in the same division as Pittsburgh, they were stuck as a wild card team. As for Earl, all he did was not only win the rushing crown, but also league MVP. He rushed for 1,697 yards and 19 touchdowns, both categories he led. He even broke some NFL records. He had 11 games that year with at least 100 yards, and 7 of those were consecutive. He almost single-handedly beat the Cowboys on Thanksgiving, rushing for nearly 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. That year, they would host a wildcard game versus the Broncos, the first home playoff game Houston played in since 1962. They would squeak out a 13-7 victory. But Campbell didn't have his best game. In fact, Houston's backup Rod Carpenter led the team in rushing. That Denver game took a toll on the Oilers' health. The following week they would play in San Diego, and if they were to have any hope of making it to the AFC Championship game again, they needed their backups to step up. Both Dan Pastorini and Earl Campbell were injured, and neither appeared in the game. Fortunately, it was the Chargers. And Chargers do Charger things, Dan Fouts throws 5 interceptions, and Houston wins anyway. So on to the championship for the second straight year, being played in Three Rivers Stadium yet again. Though the final score of this game was closer, Houston was still on the wrong end of it. Campbell was held to just 15 rushing yards the whole game, and the Steelers earned a second straight Super Bowl appearance. 1980 would prove to be Campbell's magnum opus. By the end of the year, he led the league in rushing attempts, rushing yards, rushing touchdowns, yards per rush, and yards per game. He was absolutely unstoppable. Think Derrick Henry's 2020 season for the younger fans out there. That's how insane it was. On top of that, Houston had another great year. The start was slow. Entering Week 7, they were just 3-3. Cue the 5-game winning streak, including Week 7 versus the team that could have drafted him, the Buccaneers. All Campbell did was single-handedly rush for more than all 3 of Tampa's backs combined. The Oilers finished second place in the AFC Central that year, boasting an 11-5 record. Their wildcard game was on the road this year. Unfortunately for Houston, it was in the black hole. And even though Campbell had a good game, the magic of the 1980 Raiders was just too much to overcome, and they fell 27-7. Oh, did I mention that Ken Stabler was an Oiler now? And that he failed in his revenge game? No? I just thought I would mention it. In fact, Stabler sucked that whole year. Anyway, that loss, and the mistake that was trading Pastorini for an older, injury-prone Kenny Stabler, cost Bum Phillips his job. And they didn't know it at the time, but it would also effectively end the Oilers' Super Bowl window. In 1981, Houston went 7-9 and missed the playoffs for the first time since 1977. Campbell still had a solid season, but the numbers weren't quite the same. His 1,376 yards looks great, but his yards per carry fell from 5.2 to 3.8. His efforts still earned him a Pro Bowl, however. The 1982 players' strike shortened the season to just 9 games. This strike affected Houston hard, only winning 1 game the whole year, and that was in Week 2. Part of the problem was the Oilers' unstable quarterback situation. They split the starts between career backup Gilford Nielsen and a 33-year-old Archie Manning. Their other problem was Earl himself. He was held to just 59.8 yards per game, a far cry from his first 4 seasons. 1983 was a return to form for Campbell. Kinda. He finished the year with 1,301 yards and 12 touchdowns, the most he had in 3 years. His yards per carry went back up, at least in comparison to the last couple of seasons. He was invited to yet another Pro Bowl, but that's it. No All-Pro selection, no MVP, and perhaps most importantly, no winning record. Despite Campbell's return, the Oilers themselves were just as bad as ever. They won just 2 games that whole year, both against teams with the saddest histories in the NFL, that being the Lions and the Browns. The team again had no quarterback stability. Rookie quarterback Oliver Luck was their best, but his 63.4 quarterback rating doesn't exactly inspire confidence. Campbell had had enough of the losing. The team had been in disarray ever since the Pastorini trade and the firing of Bum Phillips. In the middle of a Week 10 game versus the Bengals in 1983, the Oilers decided to pull the struggling running back and play the backups for the remainder of that loss. This was Earl's last straw, and at the end of the game, he demanded a trade. Owner of the Oilers at the time, Bud Adams, refused to trade players who requested such a thing. He believed that they needed the power, not the players. So, Campbell finished off the rest of the season in Houston, but remained determined to find a way out. New head coach Hugh Campbell took over the struggling franchise in hopes of finally steering the ship in the right direction. The start of the 1984 season wasn't the course correction the team was hoping for, and they started the season 0-6. After their Week 6 loss to, the Bengals again, Campbell finally got his wish. Remember Bum Phillips? Yeah, in the years since his firing after their playoff loss to the Raiders, he had been signed by the Saints to try to turn that team around. He got there in 1981, and immediately wanted to replicate what he did in Houston that led to success. Get themselves a running back. With the first overall pick of the 1980 draft, the Saints took South Carolina alum George Rogers. But in his heart, Phillips always had a special bond with Campbell, and when the Oilers opened up the possibility that he could be traded for, Bum Phillips pounced. He would trade away their first-round pick in 1985 to get the now 29-year-old bruising running back. However, for the remainder of the 84 season, Rodgers would remain the team's number one back. After all, he was coming off of a 1,000-yard season of his own that left limited opportunities for Campbell. In his first game as a Saint, he would carry the ball just 5 times, gaining 19 yards. Oh, and did I mention that Ken Stabler was a Saint now? No? What the hell? The Saints went 4-6 after acquiring the former Heisman winner. Campbell himself had just 50 carries that year and averaged 3.8 yards per carry. By 1985, Campbell's running back mate, George Rogers, was out of the bayou. Phillips had traded him to Washington. This left Earl and 28-year-old fullback Wayne Wilson as the backfield tandem in New Orleans. Campbell had a productive, but not leading presence that year. He carried the ball 158 times, and he had 643 yards by the end of the year. Doing the math, that is a better yards per carry average than his previous season, but it still wasn't enough. The Saints went 5-11. Phillips lived or died by the decision to bring in Campbell and trade Rodgers. They didn't win with Campbell. So at the conclusion of the season, Bum Phillips was fired yet again. Campbell originally stated that he wanted to play in 1986, but after some time deliberating, he decided to hang up his cleats, citing that his body was broken down due to old age, in relative to running back terms. He would end his illustrious career with 9,407 rushing yards, 74 touchdowns, and a golden jacket. So, why isn't Campbell brought up in the greatest running backs of all time discussions? At least not as much as those names that I mentioned earlier. Well, I have 2 theories. One, his prime was quite short. He had 3 dominant years, yes, 3 productive years, and 2 meh years. Most casual NFL fans don't remember his time in the Big Easy. They mostly just remembered those first 3 seasons. Hence why some say his lack of longevity is why he didn't earn the credit he should. My other theory involves the Oilers themselves. They aren't a very popular team, and they never won any big games. Sure, neither did Barry Sanders when he was in Detroit, but at least Sanders was a highlight machine. Campbell has a few great ones, don't get me wrong, but his bruising running style doesn't exactly lead itself to the same excitement that Sanders did in Detroit. Nonetheless, Campbell was a fantastic running back, and his jersey tear highlight will forever live on in the minds of football fans. He deserves more recognition than what he gets, which is why I wanted to highlight his football journey.